Once again, good morning, and it's nice to see that sunshine, but it's, we take it when we can because we're going to get cloudy skies, some rain, some snow, all of those things. Maybe not within the next 2 hours, but it's on its way. A guest coming in to chat with me today. We're going to talk about money. Paul Brown, everybody likes to talk about money.
Well, sure.
Okay. Paul, you and I were just rapping a little bit because you were back in what we call the old days in Toronto with the CKO radio.
Yes, many moons ago, John. Many moons ago.
Yeah, part of me, a lot of the guys you know that I knew, and CKO it was an interesting venture at the time, wasn't it? It just didn't quite survive.
Yeah, they had their challenges. They were national, coast to coast, and ran for a few years, but ultimately the ship went down, I guess you could say.
Yeah. Well, enough of those things in those days. You've got other things that's on your mind these days. I'm talking about money, increase in minimum wage, livable allowances, etc. I would think, Paul, it's pretty hard to find somebody who doesn't want an increase in the minimum wage. I would think the biggest concern is, get the more the merrier. But how do I get to that point?
Sure. And, there's been a lot of discussion going around surrounding the issue. And the figure that is being advocated for right now is $14 an hour. Currently at $10.25 an hour, a minimum wage worker is 19% below the low-income measure or the poverty line. So bringing a worker up to $14 an hour would put them 10% above the poverty line. And then going forward, we're in agreement with the Ontario Chamber of Commerce that there needs to be indexation. If you land on that figure that brings workers out of poverty, index it on an annual basis, we don't need to have this argument every few years. It solves itself.
All right. I just want to go back a little bit just to explain your role in all of this. And what is your position, and who are you sort of blowing the horn for?
Well, this is locally being spearheaded by the Peterborough Workers Action Centre, which is just a group of volunteers and low-wage workers that want to, educate fellow workers on what their rights are in the workplace, their statutory minimum rights, those sort of things. So since minimum wage falls under the Employment Standards Act, it made sense that we would pick up the ball and run with this.
What's the response? I mean, I would think that you're going to get a positive response, but there's going to be some negative activity here too.
Surprisingly enough, we've been out in the community on the 14th of the month in September and October. Public support has been overwhelmingly positive. There have been some people with concerns, primarily the true small mom and pop business people that maybe have a handful of employees. And we understand those concerns. A jump to $14 an hour is significant. But we think there's other ways that the provincial government could help those true small mom and pop businesses. Some relief on personal income taxes. Let's say you run a variety convenience store, maybe increased revenue from lottery terminal sales, those sort of things. But when you're talking about minimum wage workers, fully 50% of minimum wage workers in Ontario work for corporations with 500 or more employees. So, these large national, multinational corporations certainly have the capacity to bring their workers' standard of living up.
Let's talk about the minimum wage now, coast to coast to coast. Where does Ontario stand at $10.25 an hour? At the high end, the middle, or the low? Where are we at this moment?
Well, we're not at the highest, we're not at the lowest, and they're all fairly close. I think Alberta might have the lowest at, I believe it's around $9.50, $9.75 an hour. But nationally, coast to coast, they are pretty similar. But if you look at other jurisdictions like Australia, currently the minimum wage in Australia is $16.37 an hour. And I just checked yesterday, the Canadian dollar is at absolute direct parity with the Australian dollar. Now, everyone says that might be ludicrous to go to that kind of level and costs will skyrocket and that. But in Australia, a Big Mac costs $4.62. In Ontario, that same Big Mac is $4.59. So there's not a correlation between increases in minimum wage and costs skyrocketing because, especially for these larger corporations, it's an economy of scale. They can certainly absorb those kind of increases.
We're going to take a break and come back in just a moment or two, Paul. We're going to carry on this conversation, and I'm going to play devil's advocate here, and you and I are going to battle it out. How's that?
Fair enough, John.
Okay. You're listening to the John Badham Show right here on 90.5 FM. You're listening to right here on 90.5, and my guest is Paul Brown. And Paul and I have been talking money, the increase in minimum wage. And Paul, all right, I've got a small store, say 2 or 3 employees. Somebody comes in on the weekend so I can have a few hours off. Basically the mom and pop idea. Not totally against an increase in minimum wage for my staff. But then all of a sudden you tell me, by golly, it's going to be good. It's going to $14 an hour after I pick myself up off the floor that I got to pay. It's got to be gradual, doesn't it?
Well, the provincial government currently has an advisory panel traveling around the province. They're taking submissions from all interested shareholders. I will be with several other people locally going down to Kingston next week, making a submission to that panel.
Will you also get a chance to hear some of the other submissions there, or is it just you at a specific time, open the door, go in, and get out? I was just wondering if you were...
I've actually read some of the submissions by like the Canadian Food and Restaurant Association, the Ontario Chambers of Commerce, labor groups. So there's a wide range of views on the issue, certainly. Mm-hmm. There almost seems to be consensus that there does have to be an increase.
Right.
And if it's a phased-in process, that might very well make sense. The last time there was an increase to the minimum wage, it was done over a period of 3 annual increases.
Right,
it wasn't all up front.
Yeah.
So, our hope is that, if it is phased in, it will bring workers above that poverty line. And like I say, maybe once we get above that, then index going forward, and it takes care of itself. But even the Chamber of Commerce wants a system that's predictable, that businesses can take account for going forward in their planning.
Because the Chamber, correct me if I'm wrong, they're not against this.
No, they're not. No, they're not.
No. And, but you pointed out that they're probably looking at that incremental increase with a target of $14 at the present time. But if you got to sell that to a government, don't you?
Well, yeah, and the Chamber's position is a little muddled. Yes, they believe in indexation, but I think they want to land at a figure substantially lower than that $14 an hour. So again, if workers are below that poverty line, and then you tie indexation to that, you just keep workers in poverty into perpetuity. So that's not a solution either.
Well, you're talking about $14 an hour. Then there's another group who are saying $16 an hour, and they're out there. It gets confusing. Who's who? What's going on here? I mean, we're talking about a jump from, 10 and a quarter to $14, and then there's somebody else out there beating the drum for $16 an hour.
Well,
and doesn't that breed a little negativity in the minds of some? Say, wait a minute, whoa, this is getting out of hand.
Well, I'm familiar with what you're talking about. The Peterborough Social Planning Council released a living wage study.
Right.
And they're not beating the drum for it. They're not saying that we demand that wages be brought up. It was simply for public awareness. It was a process that was developed by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, has been applied to communities across Ontario as well. And it just using the metrics and the data locally, saying this is what it costs to have a somewhat comfortable standard of living. Nothing extravagant, doesn't even take into account, savings for retirement or that. It is just the actual cost for a person would need to live in Peterborough. Peterborough has some unique dynamics. We have the highest rental relative to income housing costs in Canada. And we have, I believe we're second now for the lowest average hourly wages in Canada. So you mix those two together, and it's not a good combination. But certainly that living wage study shouldn't be confused with the issue on the minimum wage. They're just saying this is what it actually costs to live in Peterborough.
Have there been studies from your organization or others that think like you do at this moment about the negative aspects of it, the employment aspects of it? We talked about the mom and pop situation, but then there's other stores, let's say the big box stores around and everything else, where the hue and cry was, don't bring them in here because all they're going to give you is cheap labor. But I mean, a job is a job is a job. And all of a sudden they take a look and say $14 an hour, we're going to have to lay some staff off. It isn't just the mom and pops, I'm assuming. Now, I don't know. Has there been a study done on the negative aspects of this?
Well, actually, there was a study done in the States by the Center for Economic Policy and Research, and they found that there was no discernible effect on employment with an increase in minimum wages. In Ontario, the last time they increased the minimum wage, from 2007 until 2012 last year, we added 150,000 jobs in the sales and service sector in a down economy. So, these arguments that employers are going to pack up and leave just don't ring true when you actually study the past results from it.
What about part-time labor?
Well, yes, there's
a lot of people on part-time work for a number of reasons. Some companies and businesses, they don't want to give them full-time opportunity because all of a sudden you're into a benefit package and everything else. So like say, well, we'll only give you 30 hours a week instead of this. Is the dollar figure there changing for part-time versus full-time or what?
Well, no, I mean, the minimum wage is a standard set by the government.
Regardless of how many hours.
Sure, and actually that's a major problem now with many minimum wage workers not getting even full-time hours. Imagine trying to get by at $10.25 an hour if you're only getting 28, 30 hours a week. There's something wrong in our society when a person who's a good hard worker goes out, gives that 30, 35, 40 hours a week, trying to make an honest living. And at the end of the day, they've got to go to a food bank just to tie ends together.
Well, there's no dearth of hardship cases in the community and all across the country. What about those who are in the serving industry, the waitresses, the waiters, those that in reality rely on their tips? Are they making the same amount of money on the low end of the minimum wage as the other person is outside of that industry?
Well, actually, servers are on a different scale on their minimum wage. I believe a couple of dollars an hour less than the current $10.25.
Because